I have never stopped loving that man, not for one single day. Those 12 words, spoken through a cracked door in a farmhouse hallway on a Saturday evening in October, spoken by a woman who didn't know I was standing 6 feet away with my back pressed against the wall and my hands shaking so violently I had to clamp them against my ribs to keep from making a sound. My wife said those words, about me, to her friends, while divorce papers sat in a glove box of my car, signed, sealed, and waiting to be served. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because I had to. The woman I was planning to leave, the woman I had convinced myself no longer loved me, no longer wanted me, no longer even saw me, was sitting in that room crying, telling her closest friends that I was the only man who had ever made her feel safe. And I was standing in that hallway with a loaded weapon in my car, aimed directly at the heart she was pouring out on the other side of that door. Have you ever been so close to losing everything and didn't even realize what you were throwing away? Have you ever looked at the person across the breakfast table and thought, they don't care anymore, without ever stopping to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they were thinking the exact same thing about you? That's the story I need to tell you tonight. Not a story about betrayal or affairs or dramatic explosions. Something worse, something quieter. A story about two people who loved each other deeply and almost destroyed each other with silence. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how I ended up in that hallway, listening to my wife confess her love to everyone except me, you need to understand how two people who once couldn't stand to be apart became strangers sleeping under the same roof. You need to understand how silence becomes a language, and how that language, left unchecked, can burn a marriage to the ground without making a single sound. My name is Adrian Mercer. I'm 44 years old, and this is how I almost lost the love of my life and what it took to bring us back from the edge. I design buildings for a living. I'm an architect, the kind who draws skyscrapers and cultural centers and structures meant to outlast the century. I understand foundations. I understand load-bearing walls. I understand the invisible mathematics that keep steel and glass standing against wind and gravity and time. But I couldn't keep my own marriage from collapsing. The irony of that isn't lost on me. My colleagues used to joke that I could engineer a building to survive an earthquake but couldn't construct a single honest conversation with my wife. They didn't know how right they were. They didn't know about the envelope. I met Vivian at a concert after-party 15 years ago. She was a cellist, played with the Regional Philharmonic. Not principal, not the one the spotlight found. She was the kind of musician who carried the section with quiet, unwavering devotion. The audience never saw her, but the musicians beside her always felt her presence. That's who Vivian was. She didn't demand the room's attention. She earned it, softly, surely, the way a river shapes stone without ever raising its voice. I knew nothing about classical music, absolutely nothing, but I'd been dragged to the concert by a friend, and at the after-party, I spotted her across the room, dark hair, thoughtful eyes, a cello callus on her left hand that I'd later learned to trace with my fingertip like reading Braille. I walked over and tried to impress her by discussing Dvorak, badly. Embarrassingly badly. I mispronounced his name. I confused his symphonies with Tchaikovsky's. I said something about the cello being like a big violin. She didn't laugh at me. She laughed with me. Then she spent 3 hours at a corner table, teaching me why Dvorak's cello concerto could make grown men weep. She played a recording on her phone and watched my face while I listened. When the second movement hit, that aching, almost unbearable tenderness, I felt something shift in my chest. Not just about the music, about her. We were married within a year. Small ceremony. Intimate. She played a piece she'd composed just for us. I cried in front of everyone and didn't care. The early years were golden. We fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Sunday mornings on the couch, her legs across my lap, a novel in her hands, coffee going cold on the table. She'd practiced cello in the living room while I sketched at the dining table, and the sound of her playing became the soundtrack of my life. I built structures from steel and glass. She built emotions from strings and silence. I was logic. She was feeling. Together, we were whole. I didn't know then that the thing that would nearly destroy us wasn't anger or betrayal. It was absence. Mine. The Harbor Point project changed everything. It was the commission of a lifetime, a waterfront cultural center that would define the city's skyline for the next 50 years. The firm had been chasing it for over a decade, and when the partners handed it to me, I felt chosen, anointed, like everything I'd ever worked toward had been leading to this single moment. Vivian smiled when I told her, but it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. The kind that says I'm happy for you while quietly whispering I'm about to lose you, and I already know it. I didn't hear the whisper. I was too busy celebrating. 16-hour days became routine. Then they became expected. Then they became who I was. Weekend site visits consumed the hours we used to spend walking the coastal trail behind our house. Client dinners replaced our Friday nights. My drafting table at home gathered dust because I was always at the office, always on site, always somewhere that wasn't next to her. And then I stopped attending her performances. The first one I missed, I told myself it was unavoidable, a deadline that couldn't move. The second, I barely noticed. By the third and fourth and fifth, I'd stopped counting. And somewhere in that slow, silent erosion, Vivian stopped leaving tickets on the kitchen counter. She used to place 2 tickets there every time she had a performance, side by side. My name written on the envelope in her careful handwriting. I didn't notice they'd stopped appearing until months later, and by then, the absence had fossilized into something neither of us knew how to excavate. She moved her practice sessions to early morning, 5, sometimes 4:30, before I woke. I'd come downstairs to find the cello case already zipped and leaning against the wall, still warm from her hands. The only evidence she'd been there at all. Our communication narrowed to logistics. Notes on the refrigerator. Text messages that read like corporate memos. Plumber coming Thursday. Grocery list on counter. Your mother called. Nothing personal. Nothing that acknowledged we were 2 human beings sharing a life, not just a mortgage. We didn't fight. I want you to understand that. Fighting requires energy. Fighting means you still care enough to be angry. We'd moved past anger into something worse, a flat gray indifference that settled over our home like fog. Or at least, that's what I thought it was. Indifference. I was wrong. I was catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. But I wouldn't find that out for months. What I perceived as her withdrawal was actually something else entirely. But I was too lost in my own narrative, the story I'd been telling myself about a wife who no longer loved me, to consider any other interpretation. The conversation happened on a Tuesday evening in March. Vivian was standing at the kitchen sink, washing dishes by hand. We had a perfectly functional dishwasher, but she always said the repetition calmed her mind. The rhythm of water, soap, porcelain, meditative, controlled. I'd once found it endearing. Now it felt like one more way she chose to occupy herself rather than engage with me. I stood behind her and said the words I'd been rehearsing in my head for weeks. I think we need to talk about whether this is still working. She didn't turn around, didn't drop a plate, didn't even pause in her scrubbing. She simply said, with a voice so steady it could have been discussing the weather, "If that's what you want, Adrian." 6 words. She dismantled 14 years of marriage with 6 words and a steady hand on a dinner plate. I stood there, waiting for something more. Tears, anger, a fight, anything that would tell me she still cared enough to protest. But Vivian just kept washing, and the sound of running water filled the space between us like a wall I couldn't climb. I called a divorce attorney the next morning. The papers were drawn up within a week. I drove to the office, signed my portions with a pen that felt heavier than anything I'd ever held, and placed the sealed envelope in my glove box. That's where it sat. For 9 days, 9 mornings I started the engine, glanced at the passenger side, and felt the weight of what was hiding behind the dashboard. 9 mornings I told myself today is the day. 9 mornings I drove to work in silence and did absolutely nothing. Part of me, the logical, structured architect part, wanted to execute the plan. Serve the papers. File the motion. Begin the clean, efficient process of disentangling 2 lives that had stopped being intertwined. We didn't even have children. Our dissolution would be surgical, quick, painless. Painless. That's the word I kept using. As though ending a 14-year marriage could ever be painless. As though the absence of screaming meant the absence of suffering. But another part of me, a stubborn, irrational part that lived somewhere beneath the blueprints and the logic, refused to make the final move. I couldn't articulate why. I told myself it was timing, logistics, practicality. But sitting here now, telling you this story, I know the truth. My heart knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. It knew that silence and surrender are not the same thing. It knew that the woman washing dishes with steady hands might have been shaking on the inside. It knew that if that's what you want might not have been indifference at all, but the most terrified sentence she'd ever spoken. My heart knew. But I wasn't listening to my heart. Not yet. Now, Before I continue, I need to ask you something. If this story is already stirring something in you, if you've ever felt the weight of words you couldn't bring yourself to say, or heard silence where there should have been honesty, I want you to hit that like button right now. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Infinite Love Tales by Mr. White and turn on notifications. Because what happens next, at a dinner party I never wanted to attend, changed everything I thought I knew about my wife, my marriage, and myself. The invitation came from Margot DeLuca. Margot was Vivian's closest friend from the orchestra, a violist with a personality 3 sizes too large for her small frame. She wore scarves indoors, spoke with her hands as though conducting invisible music, and had the kind of laugh that filled entire rooms and demanded you join in whether you wanted to or not. She'd invited several couples to her farmhouse outside the city for what she called an evening of food, wine, and shameless conversation. Vivian mentioned it casually, almost as an afterthought. The way you mention something you've already decided doesn't matter. Margot's gathering is Saturday. You don't have to come. Not, I'd like you to come. Not, it would mean something if you were there. Just permission. Permission to continue being absent. An exemption from showing up, offered so casually it was almost generous. My first impulse was to decline. The thought of spending an evening in a room full of couples, performing the role of a happy husband while divorce papers sat in my car, made my stomach turn. But something stopped me. Something in her voice. A faint tremor, barely perceptible, hidden beneath the practiced casualness. The sound of someone bracing for rejection so they can pretend it doesn't hurt when it comes. "I'll be there," I said. She looked at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. The drive to Margot's farmhouse was silent, but I noticed things I hadn't noticed in months. Vivian's perfume. It was the jasmine one she wore for special occasions, not the everyday vanilla. She was wearing a burgundy dress I'd never seen before, and her dark hair was down around her shoulders, loose, soft, the way she used to wear it in the early years before efficiency replaced beauty in her daily calculations. She looked like the woman I'd fallen in love with at that concert after-party. And noticing that, really seeing her for the first time in what felt like forever, created a pain in my chest that I wasn't prepared for. Margot's farmhouse sat on 3 acres of rolling green, bordered by ancient oaks and a creek that murmured through the property like a whispered confession. The evening light turned everything gold. Lanterns lined the patio. The smell of rosemary drifted from the garden. It was the kind of setting that belonged in a painting, warm, alive, almost aggressively beautiful, as though nature itself was trying to remind me what I was about to destroy. The guests were intimate. Margot and her husband, Julian, a quiet, bearded man who let his wife's energy fill every gap. Inez and Ravi, both violinists, married to each other and to their instruments in equal measure. Dominic, the orchestra's conductor, and his partner Lena, who had the kind of calm presence that made you want to confess your sins. And us, Adrian and Vivian Mercer, the couple no one knew was dying. We sat around a long wooden table on the patio. Wine flowed freely. Conversation moved in easy waves, music, travel, the absurdity of city parking, a story about a rehearsal gone spectacularly wrong. I participated when expected, smiled when appropriate, pushed food around my plate, performed, but I couldn't stop watching Vivian. She was animated, laughing freely, leaning into conversations with her whole body, gesturing with those graceful hands, the same hands that could pull heartbreak from 4 strings and a bow, the same hands that hadn't touched me in months. She was radiant, present, fully, completely, devastatingly alive, and I realized with a sickness that started in my stomach and climbed to my throat that this was who she was when she wasn't weighed down by the silence between us. This was the woman the world got to experience, the woman her friends knew, the woman who laughed and burned and shone, while I, the man who'd promised to love her for the rest of my life, went home to an empty kitchen and a refrigerator covered in memos. I excused myself after the main course, said I needed to refill my glass. What I actually needed was to breathe, to get away from the table and the laughter and the unbearable sight of my wife being happy without me. I stepped inside. Margot's farmhouse was warmly cluttered, bookshelves overflowing, framed photographs on every surface, a grand piano in the living room buried under sheet music. I was passing through the hallway toward the kitchen when I heard the voices, and everything changed. The voices came from the sunroom at the back of the house. The door was slightly ajar, not open, not closed, just cracked enough to let the sound bleed through like light through a wound. I recognized Vivian's voice immediately, and Margot's, and Inez's, They'd broken away from the main group at some point during the meal, and now they were in that small glass room, surrounded by plants in the last copper light of sunset, having the kind of conversation women have when they trust the walls around them. I should have kept walking. I know that. Every decent, rational part of me was screaming to turn around, go back outside, pour myself more wine, and spend the rest of the evening pretending everything was manageable. But my feet stopped. My hand froze on the door frame, and something, instinct, fate, desperation, call it whatever you want, held me in place. "You don't understand," Vivian was saying. Her voice was raw, stripped, all the composure she'd been wearing like armor that evening, gone. This was Vivian, unguarded, unperformed, and the sound of it drove a spike through the center of my chest. "He thinks I don't love him anymore. He thinks I've already left." Silence from the others. Then Margot, gently, "And have you?" A pause, long enough to hold a lifetime in. Then Vivian laughed. Not a real laugh, but the sound a person makes when the only alternative is breaking apart. "I have never stopped loving that man, not for one single day. Even when I hated how lonely he made me feel, even when I lay in our bed at 3 in the morning wondering if he'd ever come home, I loved him. I love him still." Her voice cracked on the word still, like a string wound too tight, vibrating past its breaking point. That's the cruelest part. I pressed my back against the hallway wall. My vision blurred. My hands, the same hands that drew straight, confident lines on architectural plans, were trembling like I'd been submerged in ice water. "Then why haven't you told him?" Inez pressed. "Because I'm terrified." The word came out jagged, broken at the edges. "I'm terrified that if I open that door and he doesn't walk through it, I won't survive closing it again. It's easier to live in the silence than to hear him say he's done. At least in the silence I can pretend there's still a chance." Margot said something soft that I couldn't quite catch. Then Vivian continued, and her voice dropped to something almost sacred, the voice of someone sharing a memory they've been protecting like a candle flame in a windstorm. "He used to sit in the audience, front row, every performance. He didn't understand half the music. He could barely tell Brahms from Beethoven, but he'd sit there with this expression on his face, like he was watching something holy, like the music and I were the same thing and both of us mattered more than anything else in the room." She paused, breathed, and afterward, every single time, he'd find me backstage and he'd say, "You made the room breathe, Viv," every time, like it was the most obvious truth in the world, like it cost him nothing to say it because it was simply what he saw. "When did he stop coming?" Margot asked quietly. 18 months ago." No hesitation. She knew the number the way you know your own heartbeat. "It was the Elgar Concerto. I played the second movement thinking of him. I always played thinking of him. And when I looked out into the audience, his seat was empty." Her voice fractured. "I played the rest of the concert with tears running down my face, and I told myself it was the music." "Oh, Viv," Inez whispered. "I know what he's going to do." Barely audible now. A woman speaking to the floor, to her own hands, to the last shred of hope she was trying not to crush. "He's going to ask for a divorce. I can feel it. He's been pulling away for months and I've been too proud and too frightened to reach for him." She drew a shuddering breath. "And the worst part, the absolute worst part, is that I don't blame him. I withdrew first. I shut him out because I didn't know how to say I need you without feeling like I was begging, and now he thinks my silence means indifference, when really it's just been grief." Her next words landed like a verdict. Grief for something I'm losing while it's still technically mine. I couldn't stand there anymore. My body was betraying me, my lungs refusing air, my knees threatening to buckle, my eyes burning with something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. I pressed both palms flat against the wall behind me and breathed, deep, ragged, scraping breaths, while every assumption I'd made for the past year disintegrated like paper in rain. The indifference I'd perceived, fear, the cold resignation, self-protection. "If that's what you want, Adrian," that sentence I'd interpreted as proof she didn't care. It was the sound of a woman so terrified of being rejected that she handed me the knife rather than wait for me to pick it up myself. I walked back outside on legs that didn't feel like mine. I sat down at the table. The other guests were laughing about something I couldn't process. The candle in front of me flickered, and I stared into it until the flame burned a white spot into my vision. A few minutes later, Vivian returned to the table. Her eyes were slightly red, but her composure was flawless, rebuilt so carefully that no one else would have noticed the cracks. She caught me looking at her and offered a small, uncertain smile. The kind you give to someone you love but are no longer sure you're allowed to. I smiled back, and something inside me, something that had been frozen for longer than I wanted to admit, began, very slowly, to fracture. The drive home was silent. Same car, same seats, same highway, same two people occupying the same small space with an ocean of unspoken words between them. But the silence was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was impossibly, almost unbearably full of everything I now knew but hadn't yet spoken. I was aware of every breath she took, every slight shift of her body, the way her fingers rested on her lap, curled gently, as though searching for something to hold, the way the streetlights slid across her collarbone in slow, rhythmic pulses, illuminating her and then releasing her, over and over, like the world couldn't decide whether to show her to me or hide her. And behind my dashboard, inches from my right knee, sat the manila envelope, the obscenity of it, the nearness of catastrophe. This woman who loved me, who'd been mourning our marriage while still inside it, had been riding next to her own death warrant for 9 days and never knew. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. I had two choices. I could pretend I hadn't heard anything, drive home, go to sleep, wake up Monday, call the attorney, and file the papers. Let us die the quiet, dignified death we'd been rehearsing for months. Clean, surgical, painless. Or I could do the thing that terrified me more than divorce ever had. I could be honest. We pulled into the driveway. Vivian gathered her bag, opened the car door, and walked toward the house with the measured steps of a woman who'd learned to expect nothing from the end of an evening with me. Inside, she headed for the stairs. "Good night, Adrian." That voice, so measured, so carefully calibrated to sound like peace when it was really just the absence of hope. Vivian. She stopped, one foot on the bottom stair, her hand on the railing. She turned, and the hallway light caught half her face, one eye in shadow, the other bright, searching, bracing. "I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." She came back down slowly, step by step, watching me the way you watch the sky before a storm, knowing it's coming, not knowing how bad it will be, unable to look away. "Now, before I tell you what happened next, I need to pause, because this moment, this conversation, is either going to save a marriage or shatter it into pieces too small to find. And I think some of you know exactly what that feels like. That moment where everything hangs on the next sentence, where honesty could be salvation or the final blow. If you've ever been in a relationship where pride kept you from saying the thing that needed to be said, drop a comment below. Tell me, what's the one thing you wish you'd said sooner? And while you're at it, share this video with someone who needs to hear this story tonight. Sometimes the stories we hear become the conversations we finally have. Now, let's continue. We sat on the living room couch, the same couch where we'd spent entire Sundays tangled together, her legs across my lap, a novel in her hands, my sketches spread across the coffee table. The same couch where she'd once fallen asleep against my shoulder while I watched a documentary about bridges, and I'd stayed perfectly still for 2 hours rather than risk waking her. The same couch that had held 1,000 versions of us, young, hopeful, connected, and was now holding two people who'd forgotten how to speak. I turned to face her. She sat very still, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes locked on mine with an intensity that was almost painful. She was waiting, bracing. She'd been bracing for so long that I think she'd forgotten what it felt like to relax. "There's an envelope in my car," I said. She didn't blink. "Divorce papers. I had them drawn up 3 weeks ago. I signed them at the attorney's office, sealed the envelope, and put it in my glove box." I paused, let the words settle. "I was going to give them to you this weekend." Her face didn't crumble. It froze. Every muscle locked into place. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes, those deep dark eyes that had once looked at me like I was the only solid thing in a spinning world, went completely, terrifyingly still. "But I'm not going to." A single tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "Because tonight at Margot's house I heard you. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was walking to the kitchen and I heard your voice through the sunroom door, and Vivian, I heard everything." Her breath caught. A sound so small it barely existed. But I heard it the way you hear a pin drop in a cathedral, because the silence around it was that immense. "You said you were terrified," I went on, my voice cracking in places I couldn't control. "You said you loved me and didn't know how to say it. You said you played the Elgar thinking of me, And when you looked out into the audience, "Don't," she whispered, but it wasn't a command. It was a plea. The word of a woman who couldn't bear to hear her own vulnerability spoken back to her. My seat was empty, and you played the rest of the concert crying and told yourself it was the music. She closed her eyes. The tears fell freely now, not dramatic, not performative, just quiet, steady, the kind of crying that happens when a dam finally gives way after holding for too long. "I need you to know something," I said. "Not being in that seat is the greatest failure of my life, not Harbor Point, not any commission or award or professional achievement. Leaving that seat empty, letting you look out into a room full of people and not find me there, that's what I'll carry until the day I die." "Adrian!" Her voice dissolved. "I thought you were done with me," I continued. "I thought your silence meant you'd already moved on, that if that's what you want was your way of saying you didn't care enough to fight. I didn't know it was. Fear. I didn't know you were grieving us while we were still here, still breathing, in the same house, still technically married but spiritually miles apart." She pressed her palms against her eyes and breathed in, a long, shuddering intake of air that sounded like someone surfacing after being underwater for too long. "I should have told you," she said. Her voice was thick, wrecked, stripped of every defense she'd ever built. "I should have fought instead of retreating. I was so angry, Adrian, so angry and so hurt, and I convinced myself that if you really loved me, you would have noticed. You would have seen me pulling away and reached for me. But that wasn't fair. I set a test you didn't know you were taking, and then I punished you for failing it." "We've been punishing each other," I said. "Both of us, building walls and calling it self-preservation, calling it dignity, calling it strength, when really it was just fear. Fear dressed up in silence and served like a cold dinner neither of us wanted to eat." I reached across the couch and took her hands. She flinched, not from rejection, from shock. The shock of being touched after so long without it. The shock of contact where there had been only distance. Her fingers were cold, trembling, but then they closed around mine with a fierceness that said everything words hadn't been able to say for 3 years. "I don't want the papers," I said. "I want you. I want Thursday nights listening to you practice with the door open so the music fills the whole house. I want Sunday mornings where we don't leave this couch. I want to sit in the front row again and watch you do the thing you were born to do. I want to be present, Vivian, really truly present, not just in the house, in the marriage." "But wanting isn't enough," she said quietly. "We've wanted things before. We wanted things and watched them die anyway." "You're right," I admitted. "Wanting isn't enough. We need help. We need therapy. Someone who can help us understand how we got here and teach us how to never come back. And honesty," she added, her grip tightening. "Radical, uncomfortable, terrifying honesty. No more silence, no more assumptions. If I'm hurting, I tell you. If you're disappearing, I pull you back." "Deal," I said. She leaned forward then, slowly, deliberately, and pressed her forehead against mine. An old gesture, something we used to do in the early years. Forehead to forehead, breath mingling, the whole world reduced to the few inches between our faces. I hadn't felt it in so long that it unlocked something I'd buried so deep I'd forgotten it existed. We stayed like that for a long time, not speaking, just breathing, together, in the same rhythm, for the first time in years. The next morning, I woke before Vivian. I drove to my office in the gray early light. The streets were empty. The building was quiet. I took the elevator to my floor, walked past my drafting table and my models and the framed rendering of Harbor Point, and I went straight to the shredder. I opened the glove box in the parking garage first, took the manila envelope in both hands, felt its weight one final time, 23 pages of legal language that had almost become the last words of a 14-year love story. I fed it through the machine without opening it. The shredder whirred and chewed, metal teeth grinding paper into confetti. And the sound, that mechanical, unpoetic, utterly mundane sound, was the most satisfying thing I'd heard in years. That evening, I came home at 5 o'clock, earlier than I had in over a year. The front door opened to golden afternoon light streaming through the windows, and I heard it immediately, the cello. Vivian was in the living room, her instrument between her knees, her bow moving across the strings with that slow, deliberate grace that had made me fall in love with her in the first place. She was playing something aching and beautiful, something that filled the room the way water fills a vessel, completely, without resistance. She looked up when I entered, but she didn't stop. Her eyes met mine across the room, and in them I saw something I hadn't seen in so long I'd forgotten what it looked like. Hope. I set down my briefcase. walked to the armchair across from her, sat down, and listened. When she finished, the silence that followed was unlike any silence we'd shared in 3 years. It wasn't empty. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't the silence of two people with nothing to say. It was full of things acknowledged, things forgiven, things not yet spoken but no longer feared. That was the Elgar, I said quietly. She smiled. A real smile. Fragile, but luminous. The kind that starts small and then lights up a person's entire face like dawn breaking. Second movement, she said. I looked at her. This woman I'd almost walked away from. This woman who'd been quietly breaking while I'd been loudly busy. And I said the words I should never have stopped saying. The words I would spend the rest of my life making sure she heard. The room is breathing, Viv. Her eyes filled, but she was smiling. And for the first time in longer than either of us could measure, so was I. I wish I could tell you that everything was perfect after that night. That one conversation fixed 3 years of damage and we lived happily ever after, credits rolling, music swelling. But this isn't a fairy tale. This is a marriage. And marriages don't heal in a single beautiful moment. They heal in 1,000 small, unglamorous, sometimes painful ones. We started therapy 3 days later with a woman named Dr. Adaura Ose, a therapist with gentle eyes and the kind of quiet persistence that made it impossible to hide behind politeness. She didn't let us perform. She didn't accept surface answers. She sat across from us in her small, warm office and asked the questions we'd been too afraid to ask each other. When did you first feel alone in this marriage? What did you need that you weren't getting? What story were you telling yourself about your partner's behavior? And did you ever check if it was true? The answers were brutal. Vivian talked about lying awake at 3 a.m, listening from my car, about the loneliness of performing for a room full of strangers and then coming home to a man who felt like one, about the day she stopped leaving tickets on the counter, not because she didn't want me there, but because each unclaimed ticket felt like a rejection she couldn't survive one more time. I talked about the hollow feeling of walking into a silent house, about interpreting her withdrawal as a verdict. You chose work over me, so I'm choosing solitude over you. About the slow, poisonous narrative I'd constructed, she doesn't love you anymore. She's just too polite to leave. You were both telling yourselves stories, Dr. Ose said, and neither of you ever fact-checked them with the other person. There were setbacks. One night, 3 weeks in, I stayed late at the office. Old habits. I didn't call. Vivian retreated to the guest room. When I came home, the door was closed, and for one sickening moment I felt the old familiar dread, the sense that we'd slid back to the beginning, that nothing had changed. But then I walked to the door, and I knocked. I'm here, I said through the wood. I'm sorry, I should have called. Can we talk? The door opened. She was standing there in that same old t-shirt of mine, eyes red, arms crossed. But she stepped aside, and we talked. For 2 hours. And the conversation was hard and raw and imperfect and real. Progress isn't a straight line. It's a jagged, uneven, sometimes backtracking mess. But the difference, the thing that separated this time from all the times before, was that we kept choosing to stay in the mess together. We kept choosing each other, even when it was easier not to. We created rituals, one honest conversation per day, not about bills or schedules, but about feelings. Weekly dinners with actual plates and candles and no phones. I committed to leaving work by 6. Vivian committed to practicing with the door open, letting the music fill the house instead of keeping it contained and private. And we wrote the lists. 10 things we loved about each other, not accomplishments, not appearances. The small, invisible things that made us feel known and chosen. I wrote about the way she laughed at her own jokes before finishing them. The way she always left space on the bed for me, even when I wasn't home yet. The courage it took for her to sit across from a therapist and say I was wrong. She wrote about the way I drew buildings on napkins when I was thinking, the way I remembered the name of every person she'd ever introduced me to, the way I'd once driven 40 minutes in a rainstorm to bring her the rosin she'd left at home before a performance. We read them aloud to each other at the dining table. We cried. The good kind, the kind that doesn't feel like breaking. It feels like thawing. 3 months later, on a rainy Friday evening in January, Vivian had a solo recital at a small venue downtown. I was in the front row. I'd gotten there early, 30 minutes early. I sat in that seat, the same seat I'd left empty for 18 months, and I waited. The hall was intimate, warm, candlelit, maybe 200 seats. The kind of venue where you can hear the musician breathe between movements. When Vivian walked on stage, she was calm, composed. She sat, adjusted her cello, and raised her bow. But before she played the first note, her eyes found me. Front row, right where I belonged. Something crossed her face that I will never forget as long as I live. It wasn't surprise. She knew I'd be there. It was recognition. The recognition of a promise kept, of a seat filled, of a man who had finally, belatedly, irrevocably shown up. She played the Elgar, beginning to end. I don't have the words to describe what it sounded like, and I'm a man who works with spatial design, with proportion and beauty and structural poetry, so I should be better at this. But Vivian didn't play the music that night. She became it. Every note was a sentence in a language only we understood. Every silence between movements was a breath we were taking together. The second movement, that same aching, unbearable tenderness that had made me fall in love with her 15 years ago at a corner table, filled the hall like a living thing, and I sat in that front row seat with tears streaming down my face, and I did not care. When the final note faded, the room exhaled. Then it erupted. I found her backstage. She was still holding her bow, her eyes bright, her cheeks flushed, her whole body vibrating with the energy of what she'd just poured into that room. She saw me and stopped and waited, the way she always used to. I took 3 steps toward her. "You made the room breathe, Viv." She set down the bow. She walked into my arms, and I held her, not like a man trying to fix something broken, but like a man who finally understood that love is not a structure you build once and walk away from. It's not a skyscraper or a cultural center or a monument designed to outlast the century. It's a living, breathing thing. It requires your hands, your attention, your presence, every single day. It requires you to show up. If this story has moved you, if it's reminded you of someone you love, someone you've been too proud or too afraid to reach for, do me a favor. Share this video with them tonight. Sometimes the stories we hear become the conversations we finally have. And if you're not yet part of this community, subscribe to Infinite Love Tales by Mr. White. Every story we tell here is about the moments that change us. People ask me sometimes, friends, colleagues, people who know the broad strokes of our story, what saved my marriage. They expect a dramatic answer, a grand gesture, a breakthrough moment. And yes, there was a moment. A hallway, a cracked door, a confession I was never meant to hear. But that moment didn't save us. It only woke me up. What saved us was the decision to speak. I almost lost my wife, not to another man, not to betrayal, not to some catastrophic explosion that left wreckage you could photograph and show to your friends. I almost lost her to silence, to absence, to an empty seat in a concert hall and a closed door in a guest room and 1,000 refrigerator notes that said everything about logistics and nothing about love. And she almost lost me, for the exact same reasons. Silence isn't peace. I need you to hear that. Silence is where love goes to suffocate. It's the slow, invisible flood that fills your house while you're sleeping, and by the time you notice the water, you're already drowning. Pride will let you lose the most important person in your life, while convincing you that you're protecting yourself. It'll whisper, "Don't say anything. You'll look weak," while the person you love stands on the other side of the wall, waiting, begging for you to knock. Love isn't a feeling you fall into once and coast on forever. It's not a foundation you pour and then forget about. It's a choice you make every single day, in the small moments, in the boring moments, in the exhausted Tuesday evening moments when it would be easier to look at your phone than into their eyes. It's showing up for the performance even when you don't understand the music. It's knocking on the guest room door even when you're afraid of what you'll hear. It's saying, "I need you," even when every ounce of your pride is screaming at you to stay silent. I was 9 days away from ending my marriage. 9 mornings of starting the engine and glancing at a glove box. 9 chances to choose differently. And on the 9th evening, standing in a farmhouse hallway with my heart in my throat, I heard the truth that my wife had been carrying alone for 3 years. She loved me. She'd always loved me. And the only thing standing between us, the only enemy we ever had, was the silence we'd both been too afraid to break. If you love someone, show up, speak, stay. Not perfectly, not eloquently, not with some rehearsed speech you've been polishing for weeks. Just honestly, messily, bravely, because the silence will take everything from you, and it won't even have the decency to make a sound. Thank you for staying until the end. Stories like this remind us that it's never too late to choose love, as long as you're willing to choose it out loud. If this hit home for you, leave a comment below. Tell me what you'd fight for. Tell me the words you've been holding back. Like this video if it made you feel something real. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Infinite Love Tales by Mr. White, because every week we bring you stories that matter. Until next time, love louder than your fear.